in London, right, why is that rising, sinking below sea level rather than Scotland rising?
So in London, why have we got relative sea level rise, but in Scotland we've got relative sea level fall? It's to do with the movement of the land. So we've got that global background creeping sea level rise anyway, but even if we kept water levels the same, the land surface in London is sinking because we've got a change in the ice sheet loading in the northern hemisphere, and that means that London's tipping down and Scotland is rebounding. So imagine Scotland had a lot more ice on it and it was weighed down a lot more, which kind of brought London up a bit. And now Scotland's rebounding and London's going down. So Scottish real estate, yes. London real estate, no.
You didn't discuss, well, as far as I could hear, because I was barely hanging on. You didn't discuss the Gulf currents. Like, for instance, I'm thinking of the Gulf Stream,
Yes.
and its effect on. I mean, amateurs have heard that the Gulf Stream is going to make the UK colder in climate change because it's going to reverse or something. Is there anything that likely, apart from El Nino and etc., is there any Gulf equivalents to the Gulf Stream for us?
I didn't discuss the Gulf Stream, but the Gulf Stream was on one of my early slides. So when I gave you the absolute sea level rise satellite imagery, with absolute water levels varying across the ocean surface, that drives surface currents. And sometimes that's supported by wind systems as well, because we've got heat differences between the different areas of the ocean and the atmosphere. And so we've got these big current systems which drive water from this region up towards the poles. Again, here we've got the Kurosho off Japan and Korea driving water northward. And these are our big conveyors of heat in the ocean surface that circulate and here in the New Zealand region down to the Southern Ocean, because sea level doesn't like to pile up in hills, it likes to flow downhill and to try and even itself out. You asked about the role of these current systems in climate change. I'm not a climatologist, so the climate component of climate change is not something that I talked about today.
No.
But I have referred to the IPCC 5th Assessment Report, and there's a summary for policymakers, which I've got a reference to here, so you can look at this IPCC website and read what it says about those. So I'm not answering your question, but I am telling you where you can.
So those currents don't affect sea levels?
Those currents respond to sea levels. And if the current systems were going to change majorly and ocean circulation was going to change majorly, then we would notice a difference in our absolute water levels, I imagine.
Just a question on that. Why does the absolute sea level vary from ocean to ocean? Is it the effect of gravity or?
It's because we've got land in the way, partly. If we had this idealised world without land in the way, the oceans could just slosh about freely. The question was, why does sea level vary from place to place, for those that couldn't hear. So we've got land in the way, the ocean is trying to even itself out, but it's got these big barriers, and that's one of the reasons why you've got higher sea levels here and lower sea levels here. The only way of getting around is down South America. But it's also pressure differences in the atmosphere, it's also thermal differences across the ocean surfaces. There's a whole bunch of things that contribute to why we have different sea levels globally. And you can see the scale in this, it's not huge, we're talking sort of 2 metres variation across the whole globe. So it's doing quite a good job of evening out, but about 2 metres variation. Hello?
Yeah, north of the Ashley River, I'm from Hurunui district. ECAN have assessed some of our beaches up there as eroding at a rate of about 0.77 metres per annum. Last year we had erosion rates in certain sectors just south of Amberley Beach, up to 5 metres were lost. That's a mixed sand and gravel environment. I'm just wondering, is anybody doing any recent research on mixed sand and gravel beaches, particularly around North Pegasus Bay area?
Okay, so we've got someone here from the Hurunui to the the North Canterbury area where you've got mixed sand and gravel beaches, and I only really talked about sand beaches today. There's a long history of mixed sand and gravel beach research at Canterbury, including several honours projects and theses on your area of beaches. But I was trying to look for a slide that will give us a bit of an answer to that. So here, the reason that your coast up in the northern area here is eroding is partly to do with our big Southern Ocean wave climate. So down here in the southern part of Pegasus Bay, we're sheltered from that big wave energy coming up like this. It has to bend all the way around and it loses a lot of its energy by the time it gets to the Christchurch coast. But up in this area here, you get the full force of that energy, like in the Canterbury Bight. So the wave climate contributes to those coastal erosion or coastal retreat rates that you're getting up there. And there is no student today working on that, but we had some last year, and we've got quite a few different resources that you could look at. And you can get them from our library. A lot of our masters and honours theses are online now.
This is more of a geophysical question, possibly. I'm not sure if you...
Maybe outside my geophysical question, perhaps outside my area of expertise. But
Well, it's to do with thermal expansion of the oceans.
yes.
Are there significant uncertainties about the distribution of temperature with depth in a warming atmosphere?
So, are there? Can you repeat that again? Sorry.
Are there major uncertainties about how the temperature would redistribute through the ocean?
Right. So, are there major uncertainties about how temperatures would redistribute about through our ocean with warming?
And then following that, how does that affect? I mean, would that have an effect on projections of sea level rise?
And how would uncertainty in ocean expansion affect sea level rise predictions? That's a really pertinent question, because these IPCC predictions are based on ocean heat uptake, resulting in thermal expansion of the oceans being the primary factor causing the global sea level rise. Then we've got glacier melt, we've got ice sheet melt, and we've got changes to water storage on land. But that heat expansion is contributing sort of a third to a half of the sea level rise part of these predictions. So I think the science is a lot better this time from the fifth assessment, or not so much a lot better, but a lot more certain. There's a lot more certainty, given 30 to 50%. Us scientists are quite happy with that kind of a range. We'll call that certainty. There's a lot more certainty around the role of heat going into our oceans and the expansion of our oceans and the impact on sea level rise. So I think we're starting to get narrower and narrower ranges in the predictions. It's starting to be a bit better. But I'd encourage you to read the full IPCC 5th Assessment Report and to read this. There's a whole section, because it's so important, there's a whole section on ocean thermal expansion.
The Tonkin and Taylor report came out in November, so the group work was done a lot earlier than that. The IPCC initial report came out in December. Does the Tonkin and Taylor report include enough information from the latest IPCC?
Yeah, so the Tonkin and Taylor report was based on the 4th assessment report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that came out quite a while before the 5th assessment report. In the Tonkin and Taylor report, they say that we should revise the predictions with the 5th assessment report, and I'd add if they're very different. But I think the New Zealand region predictions are kind of quite similar, so it's probably based on a reasonable prediction about sea level rise.
Thanks, Deirdre. Just regarding the Ministry for the Environment guidance, so you said their guidance was 1 metre. That's what Tonkin and Taylor have used, but the current guidance from the MFE is the 2008 figures of 0.5 metres by 2090, but allow for 0.8 and then 0.1 metre per decade after that. So I suppose one of the things I've been saying is that would be really helpful for all of New Zealand if the ministry could update their guidance based on the IPCC report, the NIWA report, the NIWA science, and the local variation. Can you just talk about your views on that and where you got the 1 metre guidance from 2001?
To 2115. That's modified a little bit with how Rob Bell is now talking with the Ministry for the Environment. So Rob Bell is a sea level expert. He's the watery expert. I'm not in that area. I'm more in the geomorphic response area, and he works for NIWA in Hamilton. And Rob advises, along with others, the government on sea level rise predictions. It would be great if we had one number, but I think we're responding pretty slow, as if there's kind of no number in a way. So one number would be lovely, but I think a range is probably more realistic scientifically. And the range that Rob talks about now is 70 centimetres to 1 metre. So I think that's probably more realistic. From a planning point of view, from a development point of view, it's great to have one number. It's great to have a brim wall where you can draw a line in the sand. But from a coastal science point of view, having a buffer is a lot more useful. Having a bit of a thick edge to your line so that plus or minus you can take account of variation and variation that we haven't accounted for and other events on top of the variation. I think a buffer kind of approach is more useful. Now that doesn't help planners necessarily because we tend to draw lines on maps and we've got better at drawing lines on maps with GIS, but the underlying logic says that a buffer is a lot more useful.
Just following that, it seems to me that having one number is actually extremely dangerous.
Yes, yes.
Particularly given the variability in sea level that you've shown us,
yeah,
and the variability in land level.
yes.
What's driving it? Nothing could be sillier than one number.
Yes, yes. So one number in terms of 1 metre sea level rise nationally, what does that mean for Christchurch people who have sunk by ½ a metre in 40 seconds? 1 metre over the next 100 years? Yeah, right. So it is dangerous, but there's another reason that it's dangerous. It's hard to defend an exact line in one number, and we've seen that in recent court cases. But carry on, Bob.
Well, so my question then is, do you know of any work which is going on to try and systematically define what relative sea level change is, not means or averages or airy-fairy global statistics, but what relative sea level changes are going on in the different parts of New Zealand?
There have been a few reports. If you search for relative sea level rise in New Zealand on Google, you'll find some reports for the Auckland region. You'll find the work that's been done for our levels 1.9 metres, and you'll find the kind of papers that Rob Bell and John Hanna have done looking at the response of water compared to the response of the land. Bob Kirk was asking, do I know of work that's been done to locally characterise our sea level? And I think that's definitely what we do need to do if we're going to understand the hazard over the next 100 years. We're not there yet, I don't think, in any one region in New Zealand. And it's the kind of thing that we need to do both locally, and then we need to talk about our methodologies and come up with methodologies that we can agree upon nationally.
Yeah, if I might have a supplementary, are you aware of any national effort organised to do that?
No, I'm not aware of national effort to do the physical side of what number do we use and what does that mean on our coastline, but I am aware of some work that NIWA and Robin Britton are doing about how do we feel about it and how are we going to respond to it. If you give us different lines on the coast and you say the chances are 50% likelihood we're going to get the coastline here, 50% likelihood it's going to be here, 100% likelihood it's going to be here. What is our response going to be? Where do we put hazard lines? Where do we retreat from that? And there is work looking at how people respond, because how people respond is quite complicated and it's not necessarily related to the underlying science of what the water and the coast is doing.
Thank you.
I've got a question up the back.
Just a cheeky question. If the algorithms are wrong, and on the assumption that there has in fact been no global warming for 15 years, and the algorithms fail to take into account geomagnetic changes and sun activity, which I believe are major complications, and just for a bit of fun, we're actually going to be heading for global cooling. What happens to this model?
I'm sure we're going to be heading for global cooling at some point in the future, but I think the science for the next 100, 200 years is starting to point quite strongly towards warming at the moment. Now, for future species and whatever the dinosaurs of the future are, that cooling will be an issue, but I think for us at the moment, the warming that we can see very certainly and very strongly in the northern hemisphere and a little bit less certainly here down in the southern hemisphere is of concern. So I think we do need to take the IPCC predictions seriously at the moment. But even if we forget the IPCC predictions, that quote that I gave you, that sea level rise doesn't create new hazards, we need to look at our existing coastal hazards, our existing inappropriate development, regardless of sea level rise. Bexley wasn't made a silly place to build because of the earthquakes. It was inappropriate development to start with. Houses on New Brighton Spit that go right through the dunes are not inappropriate because of sea level rise. They're existing hazards. And so we need to wake up a bit about our current relationship to the environment and where we are creating hazards by our development, regardless of whether we buy into sea level rise or not.
That is the actual point I was hoping you'd make.
Yeah.
So is anybody really listening?
Is anybody really listening?
Well, most people alive today won't be alive in 2115.
Yeah.
Will the authorities do?
There are a lot of people working very hard at the moment to try and nut out the future of Christchurch City, for example. There are a lot of engineers working very hard to model what's happening to our floodscapes, and they've been working very hard over the last 3 years to repair our drainage systems, but take into account things like sea level rise. There are scientists working very hard looking at our hazard lines and using logic to think what's happened to our coast in the past, what's likely to happen to it in the future, where do we need to go in terms of our city's plan. But it's quite hard to turn that science into policy because people sometimes resist those changes. It's very hard to give up your land, it's very hard to retreat from that, even if you're going to be flooded a lot. It seems, over my lifetime, it seems easier just to raise your floor level up maybe, or put your house on stilts out on New Brighton foreshore. But longer term, it's quite hard to address those questions. And there are some very clever planners at the City Council and at ECAN who are working hard and who understand the longer term implications. But they also understand that we've got some current emergencies and some current real pressure points in our city, and they're trying to respond to them as well. It's not always adding up sensibly. And I think a good example of that was the rezoning due to seismic problems with the land. So we got a lot of red zoning, a lot of green zoning after the earthquakes, and that was due to geotechnical concerns associated with the earthquakes. That didn't take into account any of this stuff. The people working now are trying to take account of this, but I think just responding to one hazard on its own is not very sensible.
Good.
So if we look at the patterns of what's happened since the earthquake, we see at least a temporary retreat from the red zone areas. We also see peri-urban development at Rolleston, at Rangiora, which might appear appropriate in this sort of context, but perhaps at Pegasus and Kaiapoi, is that so appropriate? And where should we be heading?
Yeah, where should we be heading? Where should we be developing our cityscape into the future? It's a good question, and I think we've seen immediate retreat from areas that were too hazardous straight after the earthquakes. These are the kind of questions that people at ECAN and the City Council are looking at. It's not always easy though to retreat to those more sensible western, higher elevated areas, because sometimes that brings in other problems. So one of the problems that Bob Kirk has identified is the effects on our water resources if we develop out west. But there are other ways of developing as well. Instead of spreading ourselves out further in some places, we can also change the density of our city. And so that's something that we need to consider. The quarter acre section's kind of a myth now, but our ways of having a large amount of land per household, per person, we can reevaluate those and look at where we're concentrating people.
Should we be doing that westward rather than east?
I think we should be doing that further away from high water tables for sure.
On the other side of Baxley, there is an area where we've had a subsidence of up to 1.5 metre.
Yes.
Groundwater is therefore very, very close to the surface.
Yes.
We've got a groundwater which measures 10 centimetres up to 40, 50 centimetres. Would it be fair to assume that, where there's 10 centimetres down to groundwater, that the area has 5 to 10 years till it reaches the surface?
So where you've got groundwater 10 centimetres below the surface, is it fair to assume that this is a very risky place to be in 10 years' time? I think absolutely.
Well, the earthquake damage that caused the subsidence should have rendered the area red zone.
I think we should have been looking at these kind of issues when we did the zoning. And I think now we've got the opportunity with new city plans, with new natural environment plans, to re-examine these questions, but not as good an opportunity as we had with the rezoning. So yeah, I can't say without looking at a map, your specific area should have been rezoned, but I feel for you, living 10 centimetres above the water table, I wouldn't like to be in that area.
No, I certainly don't like it.
And I think the argument that flooding is not related to earthquakes is a silly argument when you look at how these things interact. Flooding is definitely related to earthquakes and earthquake impacts.
I suppose the elephant in the room, socially, is who
pays.
Who pays?
The elephant in the room.
Who's going to wear the cost of the loss of value of
Yes.
land that's in
Yes. Yes.
shouldn't we live on it?
Yeah, so the elephant in the room is who pays. If we're going to retreat, who pays? In England, on the coasts that are chronically eroding over sort of 100-year timescales, and you've had kilometres worth of erosion, in some parts of England, the people that own the property have been paying because they can't sell their property, they get no compensation. The retreat is just abandonment of their properties. Do we want to organise a bit better or a bit more here and have a public compensation system for that? That's a question we need to, as a society, address. But I think we also need to look at when you pay. If you rezone New Brighton Spit, so if I go back to that, if you rezone this landscape, because you can fix it geotechnically, we're just putting off the cost of abandoning that area. Oops, I've gone too far. Sorry. So it's when you pay as well. Do we pay now, or do we let future generations pay? So, yeah, and we haven't come up with answers to that yet. And I think the insurance industry is coming up with answers for us faster than we are collectively in terms of governance.
Are you saying that EQC should be taking this into account when rebuilding land or buildings on the New Brighton Spit?
Am I saying that EQC should be taking this into account? I don't think EQC can take it into account in some senses, because the prescription that they're given to examine properties and areas is quite narrow, and they have to work within that. But I think it's definitely something that our government should be looking at. Our government should be looking, our central government should be looking more widely at these issues for the future. But then elections, they come around every 3 years. If we can put it in the next guy's budget, it's easier than putting it in the current budget.
Procrastination is the name of the game.
Yes, yes.
How variable was the subsidence of land post-earthquake around the Christchurch area?
How variable was the subsidence of land around the Christchurch area?
Uplift as well?
We did get uplift. The slide I didn't show or bring. We had uplift and subsidence. Large areas uplifted or subsided about the scale of 0.5 metre. You were talking about over 1 metre in your particular area, so that's kind of at the extreme level. But basically in the Christchurch earthquakes, we had a big solid rock mass of Banks Peninsula in one area. We had a swampy plain that had been drained and a city had been built on it, and then we had North Canterbury, which didn't move. So we kind of got stuck in between those two land masses and squeezed in between. Parts went up and parts went down because of that squeezing process, and also parts shifted laterally. So there was a lot of land change. You can get answers about the subsidence. I'm sure you could get answers online, and I'll look up and find out where you can get those answers. But basically, LIDAR is the word that you want to search. If you go into Google and you type in LIDAR, the LIDAR is light detecting and ranging, which is basically an aeroplane that flies and it senses the surface of the land, and we've had airplanes doing that quite a lot since the earthquakes and before the earthquakes, and they've produced some really, really nice maps of changes in the land surface. And at Canterbury we've got quite a talented GIS guy called Matthew Hughes in engineering, and he's done some nice maps looking at the relationship between that LIDAR surface and our built environment. So you could search for that as well and you'll find some answers.
Put aside the cost element, should we be looking at coastal protection technologies like the Netherlands have?
Like in the Netherlands? Okay, so putting aside the cost, should we be looking at coastal protection? And coastal protection can come in many forms. We can have sea walls, we can have revetments, we can have groins, we can have breakwaters, but in the Netherlands they've gone for massive dune building. So they've encouraged the growth of dunes, and they've built dunes to protect a very low-lying country over the sort of 1,000-year storm scale and more. That's really expensive. And it's not something that we would have the physical capacity to do on the Canterbury coast, given how much space we've got. It would be a lot easier to retreat from the coast. Coastal protections in terms of sea walls and rock revetments and groins and breakwaters are quite a misunderstood phenomenon. Coastal protection works like that, hard engineering works, are band-aids on our coast. They're temporary things. They can alleviate a problem for a short amount of time, but then you need to throw a whole lot more maintenance or a whole lot more money at them to keep them going. If you've got base levels of sea level rising, then you're going to lose capacity in your structure. And this is something that we're seeing globally. A lot of structures are now being removed because water levels are coming up so high and storms are reaching so high that they're useless now. So I think coastal protection in terms of hard engineering is kind of an absolute last resort in areas where you have no other option and you really need to protect something. But then I would also say caution. Tohoku had really big tsunami seawalls. People relaxed and developed and built and even stayed behind the seawalls when the earthquakes occurred. So through those coastal protection measures, we helped to create the disaster and to kill a lot of people and to put a lot of property in the path of that disaster because we relied on a hard engineering response. It's quite hard when you're a country like New Zealand and Japan, though, when the flat areas around the coast are kind of seen as ideal for development, and we've got a lot of low-lying areas in Japan like Christchurch and globally. But in New Zealand we've got a lot of space, so we've got a luxury of space. And we have other hazards when you move up slope, but we do have some areas to retreat to.
Hi, thanks for your lecture first of all, enjoyed that. Kind of subjective question, but I'm thinking about buying a house in New Brighton.
You can bargain hard on the price. When I came back to New Zealand after doing a PhD overseas, I'd love to buy a house in New Brighton. I'd love to live at the end of the spit amongst the sand dunes, but I didn't think I could do that and come to work every day. Yeah.
Where do you live?
I live in the northwest in the elevated dry part. And I understand how divided our city is though, because I was house hunting a few years ago, and I was travelling about in different parts to pick up the builder and things like that, and I'd go out to Eastern Christchurch, out to New Brighton, and I went out there just after the Boxing Day earthquake, and you can see what a different city it is when you live in different parts, how the massive liquefaction, the massive flooding that people experienced again and again and again after the earthquakes. And I think with the flooding events like this, some people are living in nice, warm, dry houses with a few cracks in the plaster, and other people are being flooded time and time again. So I can understand how raw all of what I'm talking about today is. It made me quite nervous before today.
Just a question, sorry. The City Council's proposed hazard management chapter in the district plan review, they're looking very much at a large extension, like 30% extension in flood management areas, and a great deal of emphasis is on the lifting of floor levels. What do you think of that as policy response in terms of flood management?
So the City Council is looking at extending the flood management areas, and that includes lifting floor levels across large parts of our city. And what do I think of that? I think re-evaluating the floodscape or the flood hazard across our city is a very, very sensible thing to do at the moment. I don't know what it's like to live in a house with a high flood floor level when you're getting your garden flooded and your roads outside flooded all the time. So I don't know how that feels, and I'm not a river flood modeller to comment on that. But I can comment in relation to Sue Young's project about the lifelines, so that the roads, we saw Fitzgerald Ave and how that flooded with the recent flood event, and all the lifeline systems underneath the roads. I think that's a real area of concern, and there are people working very hard to try and work out with that increase in the flooding extent that we now understand there is. Will the lifeline systems that we're putting back and repairing, will they operate in that scenario, or do we need to modify them? Can we rely on gravity, for example, for drainage, or do we need to put pumps in? And which parts of our city do we need to invest in new systems? So that's something that we're currently researching, and it is a real problem for people at the moment.
Would you care to comment on the effect of irrigation and reduced river flows on coastal erosion? I can think of the Ashburton River and Hokitika and a few other places where reduced river flows have possibly increased the retreat of the land.
Yeah, so would I care to comment on irrigation, water abstractions, and how that's influenced the amount of sediment getting down to our coast, and therefore our coastal sediment budget? I was given today's topic and today's title, what if sea levels were to rise further in Christchurch, or whatever it was. As a coastal geomorphologist, we'd probably normally naturally turn that around and we'd say, okay, what contributes to the state of our coast, such as erosion or accretion or stability, and what role does sea level play in that? So we take the sediment budget and we take the wave climate as our starting parameters, and then look at the role of sea level within that, rather than focusing the whole talk on sea level. The question about how we modify the water flow through abstracting water from our rivers and influencing sediment budgets is a really pertinent one for Canterbury, because we have a lot of mixed sand and gravel beaches, like we talked about before with the Huranui, both in the Canterbury Bight and further up north around the Huranui. And they are starved of enough of the right size sediment, so they're chronically eroding over Holocene timescales. There's been a lot of science and a lot of debate around how much worse we are making them through our influence on sediment budgets in rivers, and I think there is evidence enough that's suggesting that we are impacting the sediment budgets in rivers. But there's another problem that we have in Canterbury with water abstractions and the relationship to coastal erosion. We've got that big Holocene background erosion occurring, and that's one thing. But through influencing the amount of water that gets down to our river mouths, we're changing the behaviour of our river mouth systems. And when you pick up a textbook and you take that into a court case, it talks about estuaries. It doesn't talk